The forest felt different that morning, a stillness that seemed to smother the usual symphony of chirping birds and rustling leaves. Lucy adjusted her backpack, the weight of the tools inside digging into her shoulders as she trudged along the trail. Beside her, Martin, her older brother, remained uncharacteristically silent. "Do you think it's real?" Lucy asked, her voice breaking the uneasy quiet. Martin glanced at her, his face half hidden beneath the hood of his jacket. "I don't know. That's why we're here, isn't it? To find out?" Lucy nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure why she had agreed to come. Their destination, a crumbling, abandoned house deep in the woods, was rumored to be cursed. The stories varied. Some said a witch had lived there, others spoke of a family tragedy so horrific that it stained the land forever. Lucy didn't believe in ghosts or curses, but the tales had been enough to draw them out here. "Let's just document what we see," she said, her fingers brushing against the camera hanging around her neck. Martin didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the winding path ahead. The trees grew denser as they ventured deeper into the forest, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew cooler, and Lucy felt a shiver crawl up her spine. She checked the GPS on her phone, a flickering blue dot marked their position, hovering near the red pin Martin had placed when planning the trip. "We're close," Martin said, his voice low. Lucy nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her heart skip a beat. She glanced over her shoulder, but the trail behind them was empty. Finally, they reached a clearing, and there it was, the house. It was more ruin than structure, its roof sagging and its walls riddled with holes. Vines crawled up the sides, as if the forest itself was trying to swallow it whole. Martin pulled out his phone, snapping pictures as they approached. "This place is older than I thought," he murmured. Lucy hesitated at the threshold, her stomach churning with unease. The door hung off its hinges, revealing a dark interior that smelled of mildew and decay. "After you," Martin said, motioning her forward with a wry smile. Lucy rolled her eyes but stepped inside. The floor creaked under her weight, and dust swirled in the air with every step. Broken furniture and shattered glass littered the room, and graffiti covered the walls, evidence of past trespassers. "It's just an old house," Lucy said, more to herself than to Martin. But as they explored, she couldn't ignore the oppressive atmosphere. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker. She shook off the thought and focused on the task at hand, snapping photos of the eerie interior. "Check this out," Martin called from another room. Lucy followed his voice, finding him standing in what appeared to be the living room. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and above it hung a cracked mirror. Beneath the mirror was an old photograph in a tarnished frame, its glass smeared with grime. Martin wiped the glass with his sleeve, revealing the image of a family, a stern-looking man, a woman with sad eyes, and a little girl clutching a doll. "Creepy," Lucy said, her eyes lingering on the girl. There was something unsettling about her expression, too solemn for a child. "Look at this," Martin said, pointing to the bottom corner of the frame. There, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "We'll never leave." "Nice touch," Lucy said sarcastically, though her unease deepened. They continued exploring, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house was larger than it seemed from the outside, with narrow hallways and hidden rooms. In one corner of the basement, they found a trapdoor. "Should we?" Martin asked, his hand on the rusted handle. Lucy hesitated. "Do we have to?" Martin grinned, his old mischievous self shining through. "Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" With a reluctant sigh, Lucy nodded. Martin yanked the trapdoor open, revealing a wooden ladder leading down into darkness. The smell that wafted up was rank, like rotting meat. "Gross," Lucy muttered, covering her nose with her sleeve. Martin descended first, his flashlight beam dancing across the walls. "It's just a cellar," he called up. "Come on." Lucy climbed down, her heart pounding. The cellar was small and damp, with shelves lining the walls. Jars filled with unidentifiable substances sat in rows, their contents long since decayed. But what caught Lucy's attention was a symbol carved into the stone floor, a circle with intricate patterns radiating outward. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin crouched down to examine it. "Looks like some kind of ritual site," he said, his tone tinged with excitement. "Maybe the stories are true." "Don't touch it," Lucy said instinctively. But Martin was already reaching out, his fingers tracing the lines of the carving. The moment he made contact, the air in the cellar changed. A low hum filled the space, growing louder with each passing second. Lucy's flashlight flickered, and the jars on the shelves began to rattle. "Martin, stop!" Lucy shouted, grabbing his arm. He pulled away, his face pale. "I didn't do anything." Before Lucy could respond, the hum reached a deafening pitch, and the room was plunged into darkness. A bone-chilling cold enveloped them, and Lucy's breath came out in visible puffs. "Martin," she called, but her voice echoed strangely, as if the room had expanded. "I'm here," Martin said, though his voice sounded distant. Lucy fumbled for her flashlight, but it refused to turn on. The darkness was impenetrable, and the cold seemed to seep into her bones. Then, she heard it, a faint whisper, just on the edge of her hearing. "Lucy," it said, her name drawn out like a hiss. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Who's there?" she demanded, though she wasn't sure she wanted an answer. The whisper grew louder, joined by others until it became a cacophony of voices, all chanting her name. She reached out blindly, her hands finding Martin's jacket. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice trembling. But Martin didn't respond. She shook him, her fingers digging into his arm. "Martin." Suddenly, the voices stopped, and the cellar was silent once more. Lucy's flashlight flickered to life, revealing Martin standing in the center of the symbol, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Martin," she said cautiously. He turned to her, but his expression was vacant. "We'll never leave," he whispered, his voice not his own. Lucy stumbled back, her heart pounding as Martin's vacant stare bore into her. "Martin, snap out of it," she yelled, but he remained rooted in place, his lips moving silently. The symbol beneath him began to glow faintly, its intricate patterns pulsing with a sinister red light. Shadows seemed to creep along the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Lucy grabbed Martin's arm, trying to pull him away from the symbol, but he didn't budge. His strength was unyielding, as if he had turned to stone. "Please, Martin, we need to go," she pleaded, her voice cracking. Martin's lips stopped moving, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, in a voice that was both his and not his, he said, "It's already too late." The red light intensified, casting grotesque shadows that danced wildly around the cellar. Lucy's breath hitched as the air grew heavier, pressing down on her chest like an invisible weight. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, their words incomprehensible but laced with malice. Lucy's mind raced. She had to get them out of there. Abandoning her attempt to pull Martin free, she scrambled toward the ladder. "I'll get help," she shouted over the cacophony. "Just hold on." But as she reached the ladder, the trap door above slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the cellar, followed by a deep, guttural laugh that sent chills down Lucy's spine. She spun around, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Martin was no longer standing in the center of the symbol. He was on the ground, convulsing, his body contorting in unnatural ways. "Martin!" Lucy screamed, rushing to his side. She tried to hold him still, but his movements were violent and erratic. His eyes rolled back into his head, and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Then, as suddenly as it began, the convulsions stopped. Martin lay still, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Lucy held her breath, terrified to touch him but unable to look away. "Martin," she whispered. His eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they looked like his own. "Lucy," he croaked, his voice weak. Relief flooded through her. "I'm here, Martin. You're going to be okay." But the relief was short-lived. Martin's eyes darkened, and a cruel smile spread across his face, one that didn't belong to him. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice distorted and dripping with malice. Lucy scrambled backward, her flashlight beam fixed on her brother. "What's happening to you? Who are you?" Martin, or whatever had taken over him, rose to his feet with an unnatural grace. The symbol on the floor flared brighter, casting the cellar in a blood-red glow. "This place belongs to us now," he said, his voice echoing strangely. "And so do you." Lucy's heart raced as she backed into the shelves, sending jars crashing to the ground. The sickly sweet stench of decay filled the air, making her gag. She had to think fast. Her phone. She fumbled for it in her pocket, but the screen was dead, no matter how hard she pressed the power button. Martin, or the thing inside him, took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate. "Why fight it, Lucy? You're already trapped." "No," she whispered, her mind racing. "This isn't real. It can't be real." "Oh, it's very real," the thing said, grinning. "And it's only just begun." Lucy's hands found a broken jar on the floor. Without thinking, she hurled it at Martin. The glass shattered against his shoulder, but he didn't flinch. He kept advancing, his dark eyes locked on hers. Desperate, Lucy grabbed another piece of glass and held it out like a weapon. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice shaking. The thing inhabiting Martin chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. "What are you going to do, Lucy? Hurt your own brother?" Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched the glass shard tighter. "You're not my brother," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The thing lunged at her, and Lucy swung the shard wildly. It grazed Martin's arm, drawing a thin line of blood. He recoiled, a hiss escaping his lips as the red light from the symbol flickered. Taking advantage of the distraction, Lucy darted past him, heading for the ladder. She clawed at the trapdoor, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, she could hear Martin's footsteps approaching. "You can't escape," he said, his voice a sing-song mockery. "This house won't let you." Lucy's fingers found a heavy wrench on one of the shelves. She turned, wielding it like a club. "I'll find a way," she said through gritted teeth. Martin lunged again, and Lucy swung with all her strength. The wrench connected with his temple, and he crumpled to the ground. Lucy's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared at his motionless body, the wrench slipping from her trembling hands. "Martin," she whispered, stepping closer. But as she reached for him, his eyes snapped open, pitch black and glinting with malice. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist in an iron grip. Lucy screamed as he yanked her down, his strength far greater than it should have been. The symbol on the floor blazed brighter than ever, and the whispers grew to a deafening roar. Lucy struggled, but Martin's grip was unrelenting. The red light enveloped them both, and for a moment, everything was consumed by blinding brightness. Then, silence. When Lucy opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cellar. She was standing in the middle of the house's living room, the symbol etched into the floor beneath her feet. The house was no longer decrepit, everything was pristine, as if time had rewound. "Welcome," a voice said behind her. She turned to see Martin standing in the doorway, his eyes dark and his expression serene. He wasn't alone. The family from the photograph stood with him, their faces twisted into grotesque masks of rage and despair. Lucy stumbled back, her head spinning. This isn't real." "It is now," Martin said, stepping closer. "You've joined us, Lucy. Just like they did." The little girl from the photograph stepped forward, clutching her doll. "We'll never leave," she said, her voice chillingly cheerful. Lucy's scream echoed through the house, but no one outside would ever hear it. Lucy's scream seemed to hang in the air, swallowed by the oppressive stillness of the house. The family from the photograph watched her, their eyes hollow and accusing. Martin stood among them, no longer the brother she knew but something twisted and wrong. She backed away, her pulse thundering in her ears. "This can't be happening. This isn't real." "Real enough," Martin said, his voice unnervingly calm. "You've crossed the threshold, Lucy. There's no going back." Her flashlight flickered weakly, casting erratic beams across the room. The house seemed alive, its walls pulsating as if it were breathing. Shadows moved independently of the light, coiling and shifting like smoke. Lucy clenched her fists, forcing herself to think. Panic wouldn't save her. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. The little girl with the doll stepped forward, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "To stay," she said simply, her tone almost sweet. "Forever." Lucy shook her head, retreating further. "No. I'm not staying here." Martin laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "You don't have a choice. The house has claimed you, just like it claimed us." Lucy's back hit the wall, and she pressed herself against it, her mind racing. The trapdoor. If she could get back to the cellar, maybe she could find a way to break the curse, or at least escape. Her hand brushed against something heavy, a rusted iron candlestick. She gripped it tightly, her knuckles whitening. The little girl took another step toward her, her doll dragging on the floor. "Don't fight it," she whispered. "It's better if you don't fight." Lucy swung the candlestick in a wide arc, forcing the girl to step back. "Stay away from me," she shouted, her voice cracking. The shadows around her seemed to recoil at the outburst, and for a moment, the room dimmed. Martin's expression darkened, his calm facade slipping. "Enough of this," he said, his voice reverberating unnaturally. "You belong to the house now, Lucy. Accept it." Before she could react, the shadows surged toward her, tendrils of darkness coiling around her legs and arms. She struggled, the candlestick slipping from her grasp as she was dragged toward the glowing symbol on the floor. "No," she screamed, kicking and thrashing against the shadow's grip. "Let me go." The family stood in a semicircle, watching impassively as she was pulled toward the center of the room. The little girl giggled, her voice high and grating. "You can't leave, silly. No one can." Lucy's mind raced. There had to be a way out. Something, anything, she could use. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on the photograph above the fireplace. The faces of the family seemed to shift, their expressions becoming more twisted and grotesque with every passing second. "The photograph," she whispered to herself. "It started with them." Summoning all her strength, she twisted against the shadow's hold. Her hand brushed against the fallen candlestick, and she gripped it tightly, swinging it at the tendrils binding her. The shadows hissed and recoiled, and Lucy scrambled to her feet. She charged toward the fireplace, dodging the outstretched arms of the family. Martin lunged at her, but she ducked under his grasp, slamming into the mantel. The photograph loomed before her, its frame tarnished and cold to the touch. "This has to end," she muttered, raising the candlestick. With a primal scream, she smashed it into the glass, shattering it into jagged shards. The photograph inside began to burn, the flames spreading unnaturally fast. A deafening roar filled the house, and the walls trembled violently. The family shrieked, their forms distorting as the fire consumed the photograph. Martin clutched his head, stumbling backward as if in pain. "What have you done?" he howled, his voice layered with others. Lucy didn't stop to answer. She grabbed a shard of the broken frame, its edge sharp and gleaming. The symbol on the floor pulsed erratically, its light flickering like a dying flame. "This ends now," she said, her voice firm despite the chaos around her. She plunged the shard into the center of the symbol. The effect was immediate. A shockwave rippled through the room, throwing her backward. The shadows recoiled, shrieking as they dissolved into nothingness. The family let out a collective wail, their forms disintegrating like ash in the wind. Martin dropped to his knees, his body convulsing as the darkness seemed to drain from him. Lucy crawled toward him, her heart pounding. "Martin," she called, her voice desperate. He looked up at her, his eyes clear for the first time. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice weak. "I'm sorry." Tears streamed down her face as she reached for him, but before she could touch him, he collapsed. The house groaned and shuddered around her, its very foundation shaking. "Martin, no," she cried, but the floor beneath him crumbled, swallowing him into darkness. The light from the symbol flared one last time before it vanished completely. The house fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if a great weight had been removed. Lucy staggered to her feet, her legs trembling. She made her way to the front door, which now hung ajar, sunlight streaming through the gap. Outside, the forest was still, the air crisp and fresh. She stepped out onto the porch, her eyes squinting against the sudden brightness. The house behind her groaned one final time before collapsing in on itself, the debris swallowed by the earth as if it had never been there. Lucy stood there, numb and shaking. The events of the past hours, or had it been days, felt like a fever dream. But as she looked down at her trembling hands, still stained with dust and blood, she knew it had been real. Her gaze shifted to the forest path ahead. She had no idea where it would lead or what she would do next. But one thing was certain, she would never come back. As she walked away, the wind carried a faint whisper, so soft it could have been imagined. "We'll never leave." Lucy quickened her pace, refusing to look back. Lucy walked down the forest trail, her every step echoing in the unnerving silence. Though sunlight filtered through the canopy above, it did little to chase away the icy grip of dread clinging to her. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the house, or something worse, looming behind her. The faint whisper she'd heard as she left still rang in her ears, refusing to fade. "We'll never leave." Her hands trembled, her thoughts racing. The house was gone, swallowed by the earth, but its shadow lingered in her mind. The image of Martin, consumed by that malevolent force, haunted her. Was he truly gone? Or had the house claimed him forever? Finally, Lucy reached the narrow gravel road where they'd parked. Her car sat alone, its red paint faded and speckled with dirt. She hesitated, scanning the trees around her. Nothing moved, yet she felt as though 1,000 unseen eyes were watching. Swallowing her fear, she opened the car door and slid into the driver's seat. She fumbled for the keys in her pocket, her hands still shaking. "Get it together," she muttered under her breath. But as she started the engine, the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees cast long, distorted shadows, and the air felt heavy with something unseen. Lucy hit the gas, the car lurching forward. Gravel crunched under the tires as she sped down the winding road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between herself and the house, or what was left of it. But even as the forest thinned and gave way to open fields, the sense of unease refused to leave her. By the time Lucy reached the edge of town, the sun was setting. She pulled into the parking lot of a small diner, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the twilight. She needed to clear her head, maybe call someone, though she wasn't sure who. What could she even say? That her brother was gone, swallowed by a cursed house. That she had survived but felt like she hadn't escaped. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A waitress behind the counter gave her a polite smile. Lucy sat in a booth near the window, staring out at the quiet street. Her reflection in the glass looked pale and drawn, her eyes hollow. The waitress approached, a notepad in hand. "What can I get you, hon?" "Coffee," Lucy said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Black." The waitress nodded and walked away. Lucy stared at the table, her mind replaying the events in the house, the glowing symbol, the shadows, Martin's distorted face. Her stomach churned, and she clenched her fists to keep them from shaking. When the coffee arrived, she wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring its warmth. She hadn't realized how cold she felt until now. She took a sip, the bitter taste grounding her, if only slightly. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she nearly jumped out of her seat. Grabbing it, she saw an incoming call from an unknown number. Her thumb hovered over the decline button, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello?" she said hesitantly. A crackling sound came through the line, followed by a voice, faint and distorted. "Lucy." Her breath caught. "Who is this?" "It's me," the voice said, clearer now. "Martin." Lucy froze, her grip on the phone tightening. "That's not possible," she whispered. You're gone." "I don't have much time," Martin said, his voice strained. "The house, it's not what you think. It's alive, Lucy. It's part of something bigger." "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising. "Where are you?" "I'm still here," he said, his words barely audible over the crackling static. "But not for long. You have to go back." Lucy shook her head, her heart racing. No, I'm not going back there. I barely got out alive." "You have to," Martin insisted. "It's not over. The house, it's a doorway. If it's not closed, more will come through." "Doorway to what?" Lucy asked, dread pooling in her stomach. The line crackled again, and Martin's voice grew faint. "You have to destroy it. Completely. Before it's too late." "Martin." "Wait," she shouted, but the call disconnected, leaving only silence. She stared at the phone, her mind spinning. Could it really have been Martin? Or was it some trick, a cruel echo left behind by the house? Lucy didn't sleep that night. She sat in her motel room, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again. But it never did. Morning came, and with it, a grim sense of resolve. If there was even a chance that Martin was alive, or that the house posed a greater threat, she couldn't ignore it. Armed with a flashlight, a crowbar, and a can of gasoline she'd purchased at a nearby hardware store, Lucy drove back to the forest. The gravel road felt longer this time, each bend in the path filling her with a sense of dread. When she reached the spot where the house had been, she stopped the car and stepped out. The clearing was empty, overgrown with weeds and vines, as if the house had never existed. But Lucy could feel it, the wrongness in the air, the subtle pull of something unnatural. She approached cautiously, her crowbar in hand. The ground where the house had stood was cracked and uneven, the soil blackened and dry. In the center of the clearing was a faint outline of the symbol she'd seen in the cellar, etched into the earth. Lucy's heart pounded as she poured gasoline over the symbol, the sharp scent stinging her nose. She struck a match, the small flame flickering in the breeze. For a moment, she hesitated. Could this really destroy whatever was left of the house? Would it be enough? With a deep breath, she dropped the match. The fire roared to life, consuming the symbol in an instant. Lucy stepped back, shielding her face from the heat. The flames burned unnaturally bright, their light casting long, distorted shadows across the clearing. And then, the ground began to shake. Lucy stumbled, nearly dropping the crowbar. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the earth, like a beast waking from a long slumber. The fire flickered and died, leaving the clearing in darkness. From the center of the scorched earth, a crack appeared, glowing with an eerie red light. The crack widened, and Lucy's stomach dropped as a massive, clawed hand emerged, gripping the edge of the opening. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, no, no." A second hand followed, and then a head, grotesque and misshapen, its eyes glowing like hot coals. The creature pulled itself free, its massive form towering over her. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the very air. Lucy turned and ran, her legs burning as she sprinted toward her car. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, the creature's heavy footsteps shaking the forest. She reached the car and fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling so violently that she dropped them. "Come on," she shouted, grabbing the keys and jamming them into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and she slammed on the gas, the tires spinning before catching traction. As she sped down the road, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The creature stood in a clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the burning red light. It didn't chase her, but its glowing eyes followed her until she was out of sight. Lucy didn't stop driving until she reached the next town. She pulled into a gas station, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in ragged gasps, and her heart felt like it might burst from her chest. She had failed. The house was gone, but something worse had taken its place. And now, it was free. Her phone buzzed, and she flinched, staring at the screen. It was another unknown number. She hesitated, her finger hovering over the answer button. When she finally picked up, the line was silent for a moment. Then, a voice she didn't recognize spoke. "It's not over." The line went dead.